I'm sure some of you were familiar with sayings like, no risk it, no biscuit, right? You're familiar with nothing ventured, nothing gained. The point being is, life is about risk. It's about risk appetite, risk acceptance, risk mitigation, all of that. And to get the biggest reward sometimes, it requires the biggest risk, the biggest gambles. And sometimes you can make a big gamble and go bust. But then there are other times when you make a big gamble, you ultimately realize a big payoff. And beyond question, this past offseason, the Kansas City Chiefs made as big of a gamble as anybody when they traded away Tyreek Hill to the Miami Dolphins. And you say, well, what about the Seahawks trading away Russell Wilson or the Denver Broncos trading for Russell Wilson? I would argue this one was even riskier. And the only reason I say that is because, yes, we're talking about a wide receiver versus a quarterback, less total draft pick compensation given up. I get all that. But the Chiefs are in their championship window right now. Whereas the Seahawks were not in a championship window with Wilson. The Broncos, just by acquiring Russell Wilson, were not going to be in a championship window yet. They didn't have that level of team. But the Chiefs, you know this is a team. 4 straight AFC championship games, 2 Super Bowl appearances, a Super Bowl title. Primarily based off of the strength of their offense, why would you get rid of one of the most elite weapons in the National Football League, one of the scariest weapons in the National Football League, in Tyreek Hill? Why would you risk weakening your strength? Why would you risk putting your franchise quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, in a bad spot? Like, weighing out all the pros and cons, you know one thing for sure. It was a risk, and a really damn big risk. A huge gamble. And as we know now, that big gamble paid off in a big way for the Chiefs. And what's crazy when you look at their 2022 season is they still had the gold standard offense in the National Football League. They really did. And sometimes you could talk about, you would see this back in the day in college basketball. A team would lose like their star player, like I think about Utah losing Keith Van Horn. And then the next year they go to the championship game against Kentucky, and they had a game fight. Remember the Andre Miller, Mark Doliak team under head coach Rick Majerus? Like, sometimes that stuff happens. You lose that star, and then the next year everybody kind of like picks up the pace and you find different ways. You become a little less star reliant. You spread it out a little bit more. They were first in total yards, first in passing yards, first in points scored. Patrick Mahomes ended up being the league MVP, and deservedly so. I mean, he led the league in passing yards with 5,250, led the league in touchdown passes with 41. I mean, what more can you really say? Sure, he has Travis Kelce, who had a monster season himself, over 1,300 yards receiving. Travis Kelce is a top 3-4 tight end in NFL history, maybe higher or a little lower, depending on your perspective. But you know Travis Kelce is also a first ballot Hall of Famer. Like, that, he still had that dude to throw to. But he also used to have that dude and then also Tyreek Hill. And now he only had Travis Kelce and other guys that you're trying to plug in like Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Juju Smith-Schuster. But Juju had a solid, nice bounce-back year, over 900 yards receiving. You know, the fact that Mahomes was able to put up those big numbers with losing such a feared weapon on the outside, you know, really spoke to the strength of that him and the strength of this offense. And it also speaks to, you look at Mahomes right now, and you see people now posing this on Twitter once in a while, like this is some type of controversial take. It's absolutely not. If Patrick Mahomes decided to retire tomorrow and never play a game in the NFL again, not only would he end up in Canton as a Hall of Famer, he would be of the first ballot variety. You look at his 5 seasons as a starter, that's enough. I promise you. Ain't no way in hell Patrick Mahomes isn't a first ballot Hall of Famer. Lock, stock, barrel, you can book it, baby. So it's crazy to think about what else he could accomplish in the next 10 to 15 years. And what's crazy about the Chiefs is, where you look at the Eagles, their Super Bowl opponent, who I thought were a more balanced and complete team, the Chiefs were still kind of very one-side dependent. They were very offense dependent. Not that the Chiefs' defense was terrible, but they weren't great. They were more like middle of the road. 11th in yards allowed, 16th in points allowed, showing again it's much more important to have an elite offense than an elite defense. If you have an elite offense and maybe a middle-of-the-road defense, that could be enough to get the job done. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink to all those Bears football fans. And some of you are like, God damn it, this is a Chiefs video. I didn't expect to hear Bears football. I threw it at you twice just for your whining. But one thing you can take away from this, not only that, but also you talk about the Eagles, the team that ultimately lost to the Chiefs in the Super Bowl, led the league in sacks with 69. The Eagles were second with 55. So that is something to take away, is saying, hey, you got to be able to score a bunch of points on offense, and you got to be able to successfully get after the quarterback a bunch on defense. And the Chiefs were able to do that, especially behind Chris Jones, who had a monster season. Karlaftis, who they took at the tail end of round one, had a nice, solid rookie season. You still have Frank Clark, who didn't have the biggest sack numbers, but could still get after opposing quarterbacks and generate pressure. Like, this was a unit that could get after quarterbacks, and that really paid off for them. You know, and you look at the Super Bowl, for example, you know, they were able to get some pressure on Jalen Hurts. And that was a difference in the game. Meanwhile, the Eagles could not get pressure on Patrick Mahomes throughout that game. The retooling the Chiefs had done in that offensive line since the Super Bowl loss to the Bucs a couple of years ago clearly paid off. And you look at this Chiefs team, you know, their playoff run, you know, the Jaguars put up a good fight. They really, really had to battle against the Cincinnati Bengals. And, you know, people are going to talk about officiating and this call and that call. And yes, there's always questionable calls, blah, blah, blah. Get the fuck over it. That just speaks to how crappy the officiating is in the NFL. But when you got to the Super Bowl, like, it's crazy to me, it wasn't a banner hour for Mahomes in terms of sheer statistical brilliance. He threw for less than 200 yards. Frankly, I felt like if Kelsey had put up a little bit more damage in terms of yardage, maybe another touchdown catch, you could have made a strong argument for him actually being the Super Bowl MVP. But Mahomes and this offense were able to make the big plays when they needed to. And that's always the challenge with the Chiefs, is you could keep them down, but at some point in time you worry about them motherfuckers are going to come back like a hornet. And they're going to come back stinging, you know what I mean? And the fact that their offense was able to get points up on the board, and eventually the Eagles' defense tired out a little bit. Meanwhile, the Chiefs' defense was able to get some pressure on Jalen Hurts. It was the difference. And now you sit here, the Chiefs have won their second Super Bowl in this Andy Reid, Patrick Mahomes era. You're certainly talking about a dynasty at this point to say, well, what do you mean? It's a team that won 2 championships and went to 5 straight conference championship games. In the modern NFL, that's a fucking dynasty. And they might not be done yet, and that's what's scary about them. That's what's scary about them. Now, certainly, there's some questions to answer about, you know, how they keep intact their offensive line, or how they maybe move on from an Orlando Brown Jr., and how do you replace him? Maybe they will look to address the wide receiver position. You could say they'll probably retain Juju. They might. I would certainly expect them to. You know, they traded for Kadarius Toney last year, or midseason. He obviously had the big punt return in the Super Bowl. So they might still believe in Sky Moore, but it still feels like, you know, where you're picking with some of the picks that the Chiefs have, you say, maybe it's worth trading up a little bit to go get you a big-time wide receiver, as you'd have him on a rookie deal. We'll see. But as far as the Chiefs, I know it becomes cool and popular to start hating on the champions and hate on the best teams. I totally get that to a degree, I do. But I don't hate Mahomes by any stretch of the imagination. He's a lot of fun to watch. And as far as Andy Reid goes, he's one of those guys I just clearly root for. How could you not? And what's been able to happen to him over the past few years, I think he's finally starting to get the flowers for how great of a coach he's been. And now you can't keep him out of Canton anymore. He's got 2 Super Bowl titles. He's made it to 4 Super Bowls. Like, he's lock, stock, and barrel. He's in. And I know there was some talk about whether or not Andy Reid would retire. And frankly, while it would be tempting, because he's won a couple championships now, he's locked his place in the Hall of Fame, you know, go enjoy your sunset years. I also look at Andy Reid and say, man, the opportunity to coach a Patrick Mahomes for a few more years, that is so appealing. It's really, really hard to turn that down. Andy Reid has helped build a really good thing in there in Kansas City. Why would you want to leave it right now? Now the question will be, Can the Chiefs come back and repeat? They're certainly going to have a lot of the key pieces in place. And if there were any team in recent years that was positioned well to come back and repeat as champions, it's probably the Kansas City Chiefs.